So good morning and welcome to today's panel hosted by the Program on Extremism, the Impact of the Islamic State on Terrorism Research. My name is Hora Ingram and I will be moderating what is a fantastic panel of speakers. Just to give you an idea of the structure for today, we will begin with opening remarks from our panelists before moving to a discussion and Q&A. Now, for those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to send through your questions, and I'm going to do my best to get through as many as possible. Now, I think we have the ideal panel for debate today, and particularly given the topic that we're focusing on, perhaps a controversial one in many respects. And with this opening session, we will have the speakers present for about 10 minutes each, beginning with Bart Sherman, Assistant Professor at ISGA, the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. Now, his current research focuses on non-involvement in violent extremism, having been awarded several grants from, for example, from Public Safety Canada. Now, Bart has written some of the most comprehensive peer-reviewed studies of the terrorism research field. And I would encourage everyone to take a look at these articles, Moving Terrorism Research Forward, The Crucial Role of Primary Sources, Research on Terrorism, 2007 to 2016, A Review of Data, Methods and Authorship, and Topics in Terrorism Research, Reviewing Trends and Gaps in 2007 to 2016. We will then have Gina Ligon, Professor of Management at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and the Director of the Insight Center of Excellence, the US Department of Homeland Security International Center of Excellence in Terrorism Prevention and Counterterrorism. Gina, of course, is really at the forefront of research in this field, particularly the nexus between research and practice. And of course, many of you will know that Gina is also the editor of Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict. Concluding this first session, I'm very happy to announce our most recent fellow at the Program on Extremism, Omar Mohamed, will be wrapping up. Now, the idea for this webinar actually emerged from conversations with Omar, an historian and a lecturer. He teaches Middle East history and cultural heritage diplomacy. I'm sure everyone listening today knows Omar for his documenting of daily life under Islamic State occupation in Mosul, beginning in June 2014, writing as the anonymous blogger at Mosul Eye. Needless to say, Omar's insights are extraordinary. As a scholar, his doctoral research explores the history and historians of 19th and 20th century Mosul. And I would encourage all who can to support his effort to resupply the Central Library of Mosul University. So again, from me, thank you to all the panelists, and let's open this first session with Bart. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me, and good morning, or afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you are joining us today. It's afternoon here in The Hague, and it's my real pleasure to be here. So I have, I think, about 10 minutes, and I would like to make a couple of general statements about the state of terrorism research as a field as I see it. And I think we can then go into more details, maybe as it relates to IS or ISIS during the Q&A. So I'd like to start as a kind of opening remark that, you know, terrorism research as a kind of its field of its own began to emerge somewhere in the 1960s, 1970s, but it really got going after the 9/11 attacks, of course, in 2001. I mean, there was so much more attention for the topic of terrorism and counterterrorism. There was considerable more funding to be applied for. Many new researchers, a lot of new talent came into the field, and the number of publications really increased drastically. And of course, it's fluctuated some, but we're still at very high levels of output today. And one of the things that really surprised me when I came into this field a couple of years ago was this kind of disparity between, on the one hand, the amount being published, and the other, the long-standing concerns about the quality of the research being done. So there have been various authors over the past couple of decades who really lamented some of the quality of our current state of knowledge. I think most of you joining us today will be well aware of them. Some of these issues are, for instance, the lack of a commonly accepted definition of what terrorism is. But I think maybe more relevant for what I want to talk about today is a second issue that's been given a lot of attention in the past, and that is this notion of an over-reliance on secondary sources, right? So this idea that, yes, there's a tremendous amount of research, but one thing really holding it back in terms of reliability and certainly replicability is this overwhelming reliance on things like newspaper articles, on secondary information. And so there's a scarcity of information directly about terrorism or terrorists. And this is reflected in a diminished detail, diminished reliability. And this makes it very hard to build a field, to develop theories and to test them. And this indeed is one of the main issues, I guess, to arise from this lack of primary data. Namely that if we take a subject like how and why people become involved in terrorism, we have a large amount of really well thought out, developed explanations, theories, but we still lack, for a large part, the reliable first-hand data necessary to test them. Do these theories hold up? Do they need to be tweaked? And maybe in some cases even disregarded as not being applicable. So the data issue has for a long time been really remarked upon as a very, a grievous one, really holding the field back. And it came to a point, I think, or to a kind of a boiling point of sorts in 2014, when a well-known terrorism scholar by the name of Mark Sageman essentially said, well, look, despite all this new funding, despite all these new people coming in, we're essentially at a point of stagnation. We don't know much more about terrorism than X number of years ago. Now that was, I think, overly pessimistic, but it did really bring me also as a researcher into this field in a sense, and maybe interested in kind of trying to see if I could do an updated health assessment. So that was what led me to the couple of articles that Aurora was kind enough to mention. And it's not often that in research on terrorism you get to say something positive, right? The subject doesn't lend itself to it, but I'm happy to be able to share this with you here. That, as far as the data issue concerned, I think the field over the past 10 years, so I looked at data from the core journals between 2007 and 16, over 3,500 articles analyzed, really shows a perhaps slow but steady increase in the amount of primary data being used, to the point that where I stopped my data collection, I found that more than half of everything being published relied on some type of primary data. And I think this is really a sign of a field that's been maturing. Its health, so to speak, has become much better. And I expect a lot of this moving forward. And I think it's also something that we see very clearly when we look at research on Islamic State. I mean, there are so many really high quality pieces out there that rely on some great first-hand data, some of it gathered also at considerable risk to the scholars involved. So certainly some good signs. What I want to touch upon really in this second half of my opening statement is to maybe qualify this good news a little bit. I mean, there's always going to be stuff that I think we'll need to work on, so that's not itself very surprising. But one thing I feel is relevant for today's discussion is not just the data that we have and which is getting better, but how do we make sense of it? Or in other words, the question of agenda setting. So why do we study as a research community what we study? And here I'd like to make the argument that the agendas or the topics being studied in terrorism research reflect in a sense, a state centrism, right? So I think what's being studied reflects what states are concerned with, the type of groups, the type of violence that they see as a primary threat. And I don't think this is in and of itself an issue. I think it's in a sense only logical that as a research community, we also kind of draw our attention to those topics and issues at the heart of societal and political debates. It's also very frankly often where the funding lies, so there's pragmatic reasons as well, but there are some potential risks that I think we really need to be perhaps more aware of, because it can lead to blind spots or even biases. So to give you two examples, I think just prior to 9/11, the main group being researched was the IRA. And again, there's nothing wrong with looking at the IRA, but it's kind of odd looking at how much jihadism has shaped everything that's come afterwards, that before that point in time, the research community was hardly aware of this impending change. And since 9/11, we've of course been heavily focused on jihadism, and perhaps too much so. So I'm not making the point that jihadism doesn't deserve attention. It certainly does and will continue to do so. But we've seen in recent years developments that really make clear that, unfortunately, extremism and terrorism are much broader than jihadism alone. And we've seen a rise of right-wing extremism and terrorism in countries like the United States, but also close to my own home in Germany, in the US. And the last thing we want or can afford, I think, as researchers and as society is to kind of lag behind these developments and to have been so focused on one aspect of the threat, no matter how relevant, that we leave others out, or at least that we underemphasize them. So this is one issue, I think, with this kind of state centrism. Another, and this is the final point I want to raise here in my opening statement, is that I think I see, based on the data I collected in research on terrorism, a focus on the immediate threat, right? And again, this is in and of itself, very understandable and very necessary. But I do think there's this issue where we may be, as a community, kind of chasing after the latest iteration of the terrorist threat before really being able to make full sense of it, if I could put it that way. And it's a little, maybe a little bit over the top like that, but just to make the point. So in those 10 years that of data that I looked at, of research on terrorism, jihadism was always, I think, number one, or at least in the top three. But you could see very clear kind of hot topics emerge year over year, and they would change year over year. So one year, for instance, the new number one topic to be researched might have been lone actors. A year later, lone actors are gone from that top three or top five. It's foreign fighters. Next year, those are gone, and it's returnees. Next year, those are gone, and it's specifically women and children within those returnees. All of them are subject to deserve our attention, but it does kind of worry me because I do think it speaks to this tendency that we're very good at describing things. So descriptive research is really on point. But by chasing after the latest threat all the time, I think we don't spend as much attention as we maybe should to kind of the underlying dynamics. And I think questions like how and why people become involved in terrorism, and more recently, how they might quit and what role government programs might have in bringing that about or in supporting those kind of exit processes, while they've never been, it's not that they haven't gotten any attention, of course, but I would go so far as to say that they've been underemphasized and that we've been looking too much at the latest threat rather than at those underlying questions, and that's all tied together with this continuously shifting focus of where the state sees its current priorities. And something like that might be happening now as well. And this will bring me to round off with IS. I mean, it was at the forefront of lots of academic attention in the field for a long time. But I think, I don't know, but this is just as a kind of something that occupies me, that the political attention, at least in the Western world, has shifted elsewhere. It hasn't gone away entirely from jihadism, but there's still this notion that IS is, it's still a problem, but they've been mostly defeated, so now we can look somewhere else. But is that really reflective of the priority we should still give this very important threat in the Middle East and North Africa? So on the whole, and this is here I'll stop, I think we're in a much better place than we were 1-2 decades ago as a research community in terms of data. When it comes to making sense of the information and in choosing the topics, choosing what we're looking at, I think there's room for some critical questions to be asked, whether we are, in a sense, self-sufficient enough, or whether we perhaps follow too much this notion of looking at the latest threat all the time. And that's it. I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you very much for that, Bart. Now, Professor Ligon.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to bring everyone to a place where I used to visit when I was a professor at Villanova. It's in New Jersey. It's called Point Pleasant, New Jersey. It's a shore town, about 18,000 people during the year, but in the summer, of course, it swells. There was an arcade that I used to take my son to called the South Beach Arcade. And those of you who've walked that boardwalk know that area really well. There's skee ball, all kinds of games. There's another gentleman who used to go there, and in 2019, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison for material support of ISIS. His name was Greg Lipsky. He was a New Jersey resident, US citizen, and played arcade games on the boardwalk. And I learned about him actually through the ISIS in America project at GW's program on extremism, where they're tracking the court cases and whereabouts of individuals who've been inspired by ISIS over the past 6 years. I bring this example up. You know, his first text in 2017 that we know of said, Allah, you know, Abu Bakr Baghdadi is not dead, that it's a lie. And then after that, the FBI found over 3,000 web searches, increasing an escalation of what we would call mobilization indicators, you know, asking about material for pressure cookers, what kind of knife was used in a certain beheading video, and all kinds of things you wouldn't expect for a young man who was playing skee ball at arcade to look up. So I use my time on this panel to talk about how ISIS has impacted research in the United States from stories like Greg's. I am the director of a new Center of Excellence for Department of Homeland Security, and it's called the National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology, and Education Center. We're just calling it INSIGHT for short because that's a mouthful. This is my first time to get to present as director of this center. It's also my first time to get to say that none of the views that I will share are those of the U.S. government or any of the 17 universities who we are funding through this Center of Excellence. I'm only speaking on behalf of myself, and I'm a researcher at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. So for my brief time on this panel, I want to talk about how this example of Greg Lipsky really solidifies how I think the funding priorities and research priorities in the United States have been impacted by ISIS. I really love the premise that Omar and Haroro gave us, which is using ISIS as an independent variable to think about what are some of the outcomes of research based on their mere existence. So there's three sort of areas that I want to touch on. One is the role of families and community partners. So how we found out about Greg Lipsky, or his parents actually called the police in New Jersey for some of his behaviors. And so I'll talk about what that means for research. I also want to talk a bit about ISIS social media's footprint and what that's done for both positively and negatively about research in this space. And then finally, I'll round out with talking about our increased support for the actual counterterrorism professional, or the person who's charged with, you know, fighting and combating counterterrorism in this space. So first, the role of families and communities. In a recent meeting with the JTTF, which is the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI, I learned that about 80% of ISIS-inspired U.S. persons, someone had known about them before they actually committed the attack or tried to be part of ISIS. But only 50% of those individuals actually told someone about it. So they had seen the indicators. In hindsight, it all made sense, but they didn't know who to tell or how to tell anyone. So in our center, we have 3 projects in this first year, really looking at how we can support communities in understanding what are some of the risk factors, what the safe, right way to be able to tell someone so you can get help for that individual. The people we have researching this are at the forefront of this kind of activity reporting. So Michigan State researchers, they're in our consortium. We have University of Nebraska at Lincoln in our consortium, and we also have RTI and Chapman University, who are really looking at the role of families and how you get a family member to feel comfortable enough to be able to reach out to someone to help them combat that potential mobilized individual and their family. So Greg Lipsky is a success story, I would say, because they were able to stop him. They did find a pressure cooker in his closet, and he confessed in his trial that he was using it. He had planned to attack New York City. And so, you know, that was one that was thwarted from this sort of family member support that we think about. So while those types of projects highlight the way ISIS in America has motivated our research on understanding the whole dynamic of community supports, families, schools, in helping us combat homegrown violent extremists, I think another trend that ISIS has changed, at least in the United States, is this the social media aspect, and, you know, just how they flooded the market with propaganda. So what happened with that, two things. One, it sort of lowered the barrier of entry for researchers in this space. And so you had a lot of people who were, I don't want to sound negative, but were peddling quick solutions to the US government of how to stop and combat you know, the overwhelming influx of information coming across our borders. And, you know, the problem with that, as Bart mentioned, is that, you know, terrorism researchers and scholarship have been around long before, you know, ISIS started tweeting, right? And so you had all of these individuals with incredible domain expertise, maybe in cyber or data science is my favorite term, and without a lot of domain expertise with like historians like Omar or researchers like Bart Sherman or Haroro who understand rhetoric and communication and how to be able to contextualize this problem set. And so one of the problems with that is that the US government didn't know who to trust, right? So they invested in a lot of solutions from people with great academic pedigrees in computer science or computer engineering that didn't really have the domain expertise that a terrorism scholar might purport to have. And so what I have seen as a change in this is more collaborative or interdisciplinary work, because I think a lot of government agencies got burned on funding those big projects. And so now they're able to dial back and say, oh, it would be important to have a historian on this team. And so we do need to make sure our teams are cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary in nature. And so that's one of the, I think the reasons we won in our Center of Excellence is because every one of our teams has people from different disciplines on it. So there's no homogenous sort of one lens looking at any of these problem sets. The next issue that I will talk about, besides the social media imprint and what that's done both positively and negatively, is sort of, I think ISIS made us better in that, you know, all of us who study conflicts and rival groups know that the presence of an enemy can marshal resources and motivation. And having that, what we perceive to be a very real and salient threat across all of our countries made us sort of stand up and pay attention and think about what we could do to help prevent them and also support counterterrorism professionals. And so I've actually seen a nice shift in research that's there about decision-making supports and ways to help these counterterrorism professionals do their job more effectively, and the focus on wanting to help. And so I don't want to denigrate any of the research that came before ISIS because it was all part of our foundation, but I feel like since I've seen more come out, both from the journal that I edit as well as the projects that we commission for Insight, that is more preventative and not just looking at the nature of the beast or the nature of the problem. So I feel like a lot of terrorism researchers in the past sort of luxuriated on the elegance of attacks that they planned or the magnetic appeal of leaders, whereas now, instead of just the end of journal articles saying policy should, there's actual real implications for what this means from an applied setting and what we could do, and research around that, which has been really helpful and helpful to me as someone who has built this center to support the counterterrorism professional. So, you know, just to wrap up these opening remarks, I'll just revisit about what I think how ISIS has shaped us. I think one, understanding that it's not just government who is charged with fighting this, it's in our communities and being able to help support them and research around that. I think number two, having these interdisciplinary teams to develop real solutions for the big data that has arisen from ISIS and their social media footprint has been a dramatic increase, I think, in terms of our research program. And then number three, the focus on how we can help the actual person in the government charged with working on this and the research around that area. So as you think about your own research and how it might fit, Haroro asked me to come, and so I guess I'll give a shameless promotion to our center. For our website's going to be live in a couple of weeks. I'd encourage you to follow it. and be able to be a part of it. We do an open call for competitions every year for different researchers, and I think my job is to make sure that the funding priorities of the Department of Homeland Security are filled with the very best academic researchers, not just in the United States, but across the world. And so really excited about you learning about that center. I'll end on returning to my story about Greg Lipsky. If you think about his transactions online and what he was doing, one of his last things that we know that he read was an article from Dabiq that said, if you can't travel to Syria, try to find a way to do things in your hometown. So a lot of people will say, well, especially our politicians might say, well, ISIS is defeated, their territory is receding, maybe they're not the biggest threat anymore. I think Haroro and people who study the appeal of ISIS would argue that that issue of Dabiq is readily available in the United States and in the hands of the next Greg Lipsky, who might be at an arcade that you frequent with your kids as well. So it's important for us to keep our eye on the threat and to understand that they still have a tremendous amount of influence, and to also recognize that it's not just a handful of cases. If you look at what GW is doing on the threat of ISIS in America, it's hundreds of individuals who are counterterrorism professionals have stopped here. So I'm really grateful to be a part of it and excited to hear your questions and hear from Omar. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. And over to you, Omar, to wrap up this first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Bart, for mentioning many of the important points about the terrorism studies and the influence of terrorists themselves on this topic. It seems to me that finding a definition to terrorism is just similar to the centuries-long debate of what Orientalism is. No one has ever been able to find a definition, a clear definition to what Orientalism is. So this problem will remain with us for a very long time. You also mentioned, Bart, that one of the key issues is the access to primary sources, and that's very important and is critical to the terrorism studies. But in my opinion, I think there are 3 points that needs to be highlighted when we review the studies, the terrorism studies. One is to what extent we have relied on the local context of problems. For example, the emergence of ISIS or the other jihadist groups in Iraq and Syria. To what extent did we have enough understanding of the local context when we studied the rise of ISIS? And the second is, has the terrorism studies been independent? Was it state-sponsored? Was it a part of the academia? Was it just individuals who wanted to study terrorism? The third point is, with the rise of ISIS, many of the researchers who had no enough knowledge in the history of the region, in the history of terrorism, they were confused and they became consumers of the productions of ISIS itself. For example, I have read many research papers and articles written by researchers or journalists who became researchers focusing on terrorism. I found that they almost took everything of what ISIS said in their, you know, that ISIS had published, since ISIS also started publishing in many different languages, you would find research in French relying on the ISIS French productions, or the same with other magazines and journals, without having the critical thinking of what ISIS wants from these kind of publications, and how can we become very careful when we read what ISIS writes, because one of the main goals of ISIS when they went out to the social media and they became public more than any other jihadist or terrorist groups, they had also a vision that putting so much details and putting so much protections will actually lead to what ISIS itself wants, the goal that they will influence the understanding of the people, and they will also build their own narrative, and researchers will take it as ISIS wanted it. Nevertheless, there were many other research that actually went deep into the problem. But when you look at this kind of research, as they call it the boring research that no one reads, it's connected to what you say, that most of the studies focusing on the current trends of terrorism or the threats. So there was this kind of confusion between what is terrorism studies or security studies. Are we studying security issues here or terrorism studies? Also the confusion between, as well as the misconception between what Islamism is, jihadism, terrorism, religious groups, religious movements, etc. So all of these problems have put many layers on the terrorism studies that needs actually, apart from just studying terrorism, we will need researchers to study the terrorism studies itself and to review most of the protections that actually, and also to do a comparative studies between the terrorism studies after 9/11 and before 9/11, and also goes back deep into the history to the 19th and early 20th century. I will be back to one of the important points, which is the local context. I will be focusing on this in my talk today. The local context is very important when we study, especially ISIS, for example. Many of the research have been focusing on the impacts or the outcomes of ISIS rather than the root causes of the problem itself. And many have seen that when you study, for example, the 2014, 2017, the focus was on the security issues that led to the ISIS emergence in Iraq. But they didn't go deep into the social problems. And this is also another challenge to the multidisciplinary studies. Do we need a historian to study ISIS? Or do we need an anthropologist or sociologist? Or do we need a security specialist? Or do we need also the involvement of the military studies when we study ISIS? That's the problem of understanding the local context. When you don't have that context, the studies unintentionally will lead to different understanding of what we actually want to understand. Another example of how the journalism productions overlapped with the real research, and as one of the, I think I have the book here, or I don't know, it's the campaign against the established knowledge. I'm not underestimating the journalism here, but when we study terrorism, it's not the task of journalism, it's the task of the established knowledge, because this requires different training, it requires different resources, it requires also different understanding and different context. The overlapping between journalism and what journalism is and what research, well-established research is, also led to many problems in making the terrorism an easy case to understand. So anyone can now decide to study terrorism and they can write papers. There are also problems that before 9/11, there were no many actors in the field of terrorism studies or the terrorism itself. I refer here to the actors, the states. To what extent the certain states, for example, let's mention or name them like Turkey, Iran, Syria, the Gulf, Russia, many other countries, to what extent they have influenced our understanding of the terrorism. For example, Iran, with all of its well-established agencies that have been in many years involved with terrorism, they were able, for example, to send kind of certain kind of context or narratives that they were also taken by researchers without understanding what they were. It's just like the problem of the open access to information, the information or the open knowledge about extremism, that you can find everything on Twitter, you can find everything on Facebook, you can find everything in websites. It made it very problematic to know what is a real research here and what is not. What's a research that actually is influenced by a certain state or by the terrorism itself, or that actually missed the core point. So we need to understand how we can put the terrorism studies back into the academia, and I always defend that the terrorism studies belongs to academia, and if the security or the threats, they are very important, but it's not to take over the core case of the terrorism studies. It belongs to, as I said, it will need historians, it will need sociologists, anthropologists, all of them to work together in order to produce a better understanding of terrorism, but also to set up goals of why do we want to study terrorism. And this is also a very important question here we need to always raise. Why do you want to study terrorism? Is it because you want to stop threats, current threats, immediate threats, or do you want actually to find a solution to the whole problem itself? Because we will find solutions. We have almost found solutions to prevent Al-Qaeda from making other attacks. But as you have seen, ISIS emerged, and there's always also a possibility that ISIS will not be able to make major attacks, but can we stop other organizations from emerging? That's also the case, and the question of terrorism, we have to first think of why do we want to study terrorism, how, when, where, and what kind of resources. In my opinion, the primary resources are no more the issue. They are actually part of the misleading, because when we talk about primary resources, we have to be careful of what the primary resources are they. Are they the productions of ISIS or the internal documents of ISIS? They are the productions of extremists, etc. Thank you. I hope I didn't take more time. Yeah, it's 12 minutes. Thank you.
It was perfect. Thank you, Omar. That was fantastic. And look, it also happens to be a perfect segue into how certainly I'd like to open up the discussion here. All of the speakers referred to definitional issues that have kind of plagued this area of research. And I mean, let's get straight to really the top of the issue, which is this ongoing debate about terrorism studies as a discipline. Is it a discipline unto itself? Should it be considered that way? Is perhaps that a future goal? Now, I know we've all discussed this idea of it being interdisciplinary. To what extent should we think about terrorism studies as a discipline unto itself? And if we don't think about it that way now, is that a goal? Bart, would you like to perhaps open briefly on that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, difficult question, actually. I don't think it's a discipline unto itself. I'm not sure it should be one. I think currently one of the issues we still have is, yes, it's multidisciplinary, but I don't think we give all relevant disciplines their equal share. So for instance, in criminology, in psychology, I think in many instances they're years ahead of what's going on in terrorism studies. So I think rather than making terrorism studies a discipline onto itself with, maybe its own kind of theoretical methodological outlook, I think we need to do a better job of utilizing the knowledge and the methods that are already out there. Because I think also we risk maybe making terrorism something exceptional, which, it's an exceptionally harsh type of violence, but it's not something outside of normal rules of behavior, and if you understand what I mean. Like it's part and parcel of the domains of psychology and criminology. It's not something special in and of itself that cannot be studied or understood with those existing insights. So I think we also risk making this, in a sense, making it seem maybe more enigmatic, if that's the right word, than it is. So I would be in favor of making better use of the knowledge already in related disciplines.
Gina, do you have something to add to that?
I think our approach is comparable to Bart's in that, if you look at the education projects that we're funding in Insight for DHS, it's really an invitation to STEM fields, for example, engineering, science, technology, math, to partner with experts like someone like Omar or Bart, who've been studying this domain in the context and seeing how they could invite and sort of inspire their students to want to learn more and be a part of it, with the caveat that they have a lot to learn about the context and the domain. But I think it's important that we honor all of the specific disciplines that could contribute to this problem set. I would probably echo about communication studies as well. I feel like they have a lot to tell us about influence, and that's a significant problem set that we think about from a leadership perspective. Thanks.
Omar, I'd like you to kind of address this question, but I was really interested the point that I did with there, this idea that perhaps the availability of primary sources, for all the benefits it brought along, it also brought problems along with it. I'm particularly in relation to this idea of a lower bar for entry that kind of emerged perhaps as a consequence of the accessibility of primary source materials, the variety of teachers and journalists and the bits and pieces in between getting involved in this field. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when I say that the primary sources might be also an issue when you study terrorism, I here refer to the importance of any researcher needs to look into these resources, needs very well established knowledge in all the case, that they need a training in understanding many things, and that's also the local context itself. There are other issues around these primary sources. I mean, as a historian, I always deal with the primary sources, and one of the issues when I study a manuscript, if I just take it as it is, I might be just repeating what that historian who wrote this document wants me to say. He just wants me to transmit his message. So the case is, there are two different kinds of primary sources. One is, as I said, the internal documents, like what program on extremism have. These are administrative documents. We can better understand. We will not fall in the ISIS ideology, but these are administrative documents, and you can clearly understand them. The other kind of primary resources are the productions of ISIS, the literature of ISIS, the media productions of ISIS. Many have been using these and consuming these sources without actually looking into what strategy lies behind them, because ISIS also doesn't publish things only just for the sake of informing the people. They have another reason. There are actually many other reasons. And imagine that someone who doesn't have enough knowledge and they come and take Dabiq journal, for example, he will fall in the how much beautiful the English language ISIS is using in this. So it will lead to other problems. That's why I defend that terrorism studies should be a discipline of its own self. It's also, as Bart said, it's multidisciplinary, but it should be developed into a discipline. It should be developed into producing more training, more knowledge on the old issues, also more history into the context, more sociology. Mixing all of these together will help us to understand how terrorism and what mechanism the terrorism have, because they are developing. They are not standing on one stage. They are developing. ISIS of today will not be the same of tomorrow, or whatever comes later. They are learning from each other, and also most importantly, they are learning from the research about them. They are learning, they are reading, they have access to what we write. So we have to also always be careful how to address these issues. And it's always important when you deal with the primary resources, you have enough knowledge of what you are dealing with.
Let's now turn to, I guess, one of the perhaps the key kind of medium for making these primary sources available to research and others. And that's the impact that social media has had on this field, and particularly research in this field. And Gina, I'm really interested, particularly given your role as an editor of a journal, being at really the forefront of that nexus between the research and practice. What impact has the availability of primary sources on social media kind of had? But beyond just the primary sources, these social media kind of based analyses. Now, I've read many critiques and heard many critiques, perhaps by some of the panelists here, about those analyses and not meeting even the most basic social science methodology. And yet they're kind of published, they seem to make an impact, and yet there's these online, for example, the networks and the individuals that make up those networks, it's impossible to verify those individuals. I'm just interested in your thoughts in that regard.
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I also think about civil liberties and, Americans need to protect the identities of people who we don't know were involved in ISIS, but maybe they have a social media handle that looks like they supported them. And so I think about one of the things as an editor that I've seen is the need to protect personally identifying information about the individuals who are tweeting in support of it or posting videos, particularly children. When that comes across my desk and I see a picture of a kid who is holding an AR-15, maybe it's sensationalistic and gets a lot of hits, but that's a victim of ISIS. And so I think one of the impacts of social media too has been sort of this need for better stewardship of verifying that these individuals were actually playing a volitional role in the organization and not just swept up to be part of it, and making sure that we're protecting them. Same as you would protect a victim of a sex abuse case, right? And they're all victims. And so thinking about how we do that, that's been one part of it. I think the second piece is there's been a lot of really great research that's come out with best practices for reporting social media analyses and how you actually conduct those multivariate analyses. And so I'm seeing reviewers ask in the methods section for very specific steps that people took to treat their data and verify that it wasn't bots or that it wasn't, that it was a verified account. And so that's been really interesting to see that evolution as I've been part of this as well. So I think we're getting better. I think that, you know, that people like us and people like Program on Extremism who take, you know, really serious care to make sure we're treating the data, the open source, the primary sources in a way that is respectful and good stewards of the what we've been entitled to view is a really important advancement for this literature. Thanks.
I think a related question, perhaps best for Bart, given the publications that we opened with today. What have you noticed in terms of, I guess, the ethics around research in this field, the processes that you know, kind of traditionally were absolutely standard for research with human subjects? How have you seen that change over the years and through the publications, particularly say social media versus field research?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, so the stuff I did for those articles that you mentioned earlier, that didn't look specifically at ethics. So it's not a question I can answer directly, I think. But maybe one thing, and I'm not sure there's an ethics reason for, but one thing that did stand out, as I remember now, is there's an absolute lack of experimental research designs, at least in the core terrorism journals that I looked at over that period. Maybe outside of it, I'm not so sure. But for instance, there's a lot of attention for the subject of mental health and terrorism, right? And it's a very important one. But I think to learn more about it, we need to strengthen their empirical basis as well. But so you expect something like psychiatrists or psychologists looking at terrorists in a clinical setting. And I think over that 10-year period, there were a total of 2 pieces that had anything to say about it. Now, I'm not sure that ethics is the reason why this is maybe, there's a little this type of research. It might be one, because it certainly touches on all kinds of tricky questions. But other than that, I'm afraid maybe one of the other panelists is better suited to answering the question.
Well, Omar, I mean, it seems to me that so much of what you've kind of referred to both in your opening remarks and in your response is really, it very much is, there are ethical issues attached to what you were describing, you know, concerns about the way that perhaps the lack of actual analysis, beyond just description, beyond getting clickbaits because you can put screenshots up of the latest bit of propaganda, actual analysis, the lack of that analysis, a lot of the trends that you referred to and that you expressed concern about they seem to have ethical implications. I wonder, like, how can some of those be, I guess, better understood and perhaps addressed?
To be honest, it's very difficult when it comes to this point, because there are many actors in the field. It's kind of like, it seems almost impossible to even set up a common ethical rules, because it depends on how the certain agency, how certain state define the ethics themselves, and how they actually define terrorism itself. But when I refer to bringing back the terrorism studies where it belongs to the university, at least we can rule the terrorism studies within the university ethics. At least we can limit the damage, if I may say, because there has been damage has been done through the terrorism studies, whether they intended to or it was unintentional, but there has been damage, because when we look at the terrorism, we shouldn't just look at the terrorist organizations themselves, but we should also look at the subject of this terrorism, which is the people, the communities, the countries, the history of these countries, etc. There are sometimes problems that might prevent some researchers from researching a certain case for the sake of not making damage to a certain community. So it's a very sensitive issue. It's not easy to deal with, but when you bring it back to, when you rule it with the university and the established knowledge rules, you will be able at least to limit some of the damage.
With the last few minutes that we have here, I thought it might be good to kind of transition towards practice and the relationship between research and practice. So one question actually that has come from our audience here is, what can government institutions do better when engaging with the research community? And perhaps Gina, you could start with your reflections on that question. What government institutions can do better when engaging with the research community? And then perhaps Bart could kind of reflect on maybe the vice versa of that question, what the research community can do a bit better.
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you asked it. So if you look at our funding portfolio, we actually have equal amount of dollars going to study right-wing extremists as we do Salafi jihadist extremists, and that's directly following the DHS strategic framework for targeted violence and terrorism prevention. So those are priorities for us. And so the more kind of strategy documents that governments can provide, because what we will then do in terms of funding choices is follow those strategies to make sure that we are doing research to support their objectives and goals. So that's one piece. The second, I think, is to engage with researchers at the very start of their projects and make sure that they help define what problems keep them up at night as government officials. Too often is there sort of a disconnect between academics and government. And so what we're trying to do in Insight is make sure that they help define the problem. The researchers are going to be the experts who create the methodology and do the analyses to actually bring some solutions to it. But in terms of defining the problem, we're really looking to governments to be more partners with us. Thanks.
Yeah, and Horo, if I could just jump in on your question there, I think Gina's already answered it very well. I think the reverse of what can researchers do better when engaging with governments? Well, I think one of the things is perhaps to start by asking, what question do government agencies what would they like to see addressed? I think we're very good as researchers as coming up with all kinds of topics and questions that we think are interesting and that need attention right now. And of course they do. But if we go down this route where you engage with government agencies, right, then I think, you know, like any kind of, let's say you're designing software, the first thing you do is you ask a client, what are you looking for? Right. So I think maybe starting that conversation at a very basic point, and then also something I think Gina was mentioning is making sure that the questions asked are answerable and are concrete, and that expectations are managed. I think is another really important one. I mean, I think we have a tendency to say at the end of any project, whether it's 1 month or 5 years, more research is needed. And of course it is. That's always true, I guess. But maybe we can also try and be a little bit better. Okay, we need more research on a certain topic. What have we concretely learned about what we've been doing so far? And how might that, in a very practical sense, help people who are policymakers or CT practitioners?
Another important kind of, I think, dimension to this question of how to improve the advice that scholars are providing to government is the larger issue of how can we best bring in local perspectives from, for example, from Iraq, from the Philippines, from Syria, from Nigeria or other parts of the world. That how do we get those kind of perspectives and kind of not just in terms of researchers, but those of us who have tried to implement capacity building programs in different countries. There is an industry there of kind of gatekeepers, you know, typically Western educated kind of gatekeeper that will kind of like there is an industry to access kind of local communities. and you know, the kind of fixer industry and this type of thing. Omar, what do you think, particularly Western research institutions can do to develop those relationships with local scholars and local researchers, and also in terms of the field of practice?
Yeah, there are two main points about this. First, that any researcher from the West, from wherever, it doesn't matter actually, but any researcher who wants to study, for example, let's mention Iraq, they have to always go with the sense that there is a written history, there is a written notes somewhere. I always have this belief, and I believe it because I myself, so everyone was saying, for example, there is no written history for Mosul from 1845 to 1925. And for 5 years, I kept saying, no, there is, although I didn't know, until I found a manuscript hidden inside another one. So the people write, they document their life, they produce it in different forums. It's always important to ask around, it's always important to get the people to speak about this, so you can at least have, when we discuss the primary sources, that they are mainly coming from ISIS, then you will have a different primary sources that comes from the local narrative. It's very important to always look into this. And the second is interacting more with universities in these countries, interacting more with researchers. You and I, Haroro, we discussed this many times, of how it's important to bring those researchers from these countries to the table, to listen to their perspective. They might bring something different from what we understand, because they were part of the context itself, they were part of the events. So with all of this, with the Western universities bringing everything together, I think this will improve the terrorism studies in order to produce a better academic and better knowledge about this, to tackle the issue, and also to help establishing the discipline of terrorism studies.
I've just received a really excellent question here, directed to all the panelists, actually, that I think would be very useful, certainly for this person who's asking the question, but for both practitioners and emerging researchers out there as well as perhaps more seasoned ones too. And that's, what steps do you all take, or do you teach to your students to help them to become more aware of the biases that may creep into their analysis? And in particular, the research methods and the research kind of practices that you've applied yourselves, or perhaps you've seen others apply that are useful. Perhaps we could work back through to Bart to start with, and then Gina.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, it's a great question. If I try and think on the spot for a shortish answer, a couple of things pop up. One is source criticism. So we talk a lot about sources, right? So sometimes it's a treasure trove. You come across, I don't know, in this case, let's say data on or from Islamic State, or you find access to, you finally get access to government information that you've been applying for 2.5 years. Even then, I think any type of data, regardless of who made it, has to be criticized very clearly. Like, who wrote it, who made it, for what purpose, for what audience, what kind of biases could be distorting this information? Is it maybe not a factual account simply of what happened? So I think this is a kind of standard practice, of course, but it's doubly important in a field where sometimes data can seem so unique that you're just happy to have it. And the second thing, and a lot of it depends on the question of you're answering or trying to address, of course. But for instance, I do a lot of work on trying to make sense of how and why people become involved in extremism. And what's helped me is to not rely on one single theoretical perspective and maybe get bogged down in it, but to see, also to use the multidisciplinarity of this field. What variety and perspectives do we have? And how can I learn, how can I paint a bigger picture of what might be going on by relying on a couple of them at least, rather than just on one. And it's also I think a counterweight to approaching these issues from one kind of direction only. And I'll leave it at that for a moment.
Yeah, I'll just add 2 ways that we do it in our lab, because we do have a lot of humans looking at our data, and so there's biases that come with that. So I'm a psychologist by training, organizational psychologist, and so training on decision-making biases is an important part of our what we call rater training that we use for any students who are on our projects. And so that's a big piece of what we do as part of something I believe as a psychologist. We all need to be aware of our psychological pitfalls and biases. The other piece is we never have just one individual make an assessment of one piece of data. So one of the concepts in psychology and a lot of fields is reliability is necessary but not sufficient for validity. And so we try to have multiple raters, at least 3, per assessment that they're making, like about, say, for example, a leadership style, Aurora, when we're content coding a speech. And I think the key is having students who are from very different disciplinary training. So students who are majoring in Islamic studies, or students who are majoring in criminology, students in psychology, and to have all of them look through their different lenses at the same piece of data and come to the same assessment is a really important part of our process to make sure that we have sort of reliable and hopefully valid judgments, because we are all human and we do make errors. Thanks.
Omar, I'm obviously interested to hear your views on avoiding biases, but we've received quite a few questions here, kind of basically asking for your advice to researchers and how best they can approach you know, this difficult subject matter. So interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's again very important to treat terrorism studies as an established knowledge. That's a very important point to start with. And second is, it's okay not to publish an article or 2 articles in 1 month. It's okay to wait until, like, I wrote for Encyclopedia of Islam 1,500 words. It took me 2 years. So it's okay not to publish many things. Take your time, research more. Do not trust the resources. Don't trust the sources. The sources are always suspected. They are always questionable. It will give you more rooms of thinking, to be critical, talk to others, see the different. Also, there is a very important point, and I give it to researchers because I do this. Whatever you study, a personality, a group, etc., put always on your left hand a chronology of no less than 10 to 20 years. Put this chronology of events happened there, and then this will help you to better understand this current event. If you study, for example, in our historical studies, when I study a historian, I put the historian on one side and put 20 years before he was born, during his lifetime, and 20 years after he died, a chronology of events in order to understand the context very well. And this will keep you always in the core point of what you are researching, but most importantly, raising more questions than just seeking answers. The questions will help better understanding the case. Thank you.
I mean, that would have been a perfect way to wrap up today's panel, but I can't finish the panel without addressing just one more issue, particularly given the feedback that we've been receiving here. And the issue, of course, is on researcher welfare, and where the issue of institutional responsibility versus the personal responsibility of the researcher. Has the lower bar of entry perhaps resulted in researchers being part of this field that perhaps aren't, that this may not be the best field of research for them for a variety of different reasons. But I'm interested in all of your thoughts on where how researchers should kind of address this question and find that balance where, you know, there doesn't become a vanity war for who is suffering the most for their field, which I think can be equally destructive. I don't know who'd like to go first, but I'd like to hear from all the panelists to wrap up.
Okay, I'll go first. We're trying to see who unmuted first. I'm grateful you asked this question. You know, I first want to say that people who do field research, like you, Haroro, have far more, I would say, adverse conditions than those of us who study it safely from behind our computer screen have. And so I certainly don't want to aggrandize, you know, my ability to watch a propaganda video and make it seem like it's equivalent, because I think there's a lot of researchers in this space who are risking their personal safety for science in this area, and I am grateful for you for doing that. And but I do think it's important for us as researchers to protect, especially students who may believe that, you know, they can handle seeing a beheading video or a raw image of that, you know, hasn't necessarily been seen by others, and for the sensational properties of that, because what happens is they get desensitized to it. And I've seen this over the years of students in my lab, you know, and understanding that these are actual humans and not a movie or a video game. And I do think that we have a responsibility as researchers to give them a realistic job preview, but then also rotate them. So we rotate students in our lab so they're not constantly on, you know, the cyber team, right? Because we want them to then go and take a mental break. So that's one of the strategies that we've taken. I'm reading voraciously and learning from all of my colleagues in this space, because I think, you know, if I look at people, you know, work like Charlie Winter and Seamus Hughes and people who are doing work in this space have really creative and good ideas about how to protect ourselves. Nia Bloom's done some really good work in that space as well. So just making sure that we are learning from each other and are kind to each other is also really important for me. Thanks for asking.
So I'm happy to be very brief. I mean, I haven't done this type of work where I've looked at these horrible images from IS or other groups in detail. So I think it's best actually if maybe I give my time to Omar, because I think that's a more, he probably has some more useful answers in this regard.
Yeah.
And thank you, Omar, to wrap up the panel today. Thanks, mate.
I don't know if I have more words to say, but I actually don't only study terrorism, but I lived under the rule of terrorism itself, documented their atrocities day by day. What you have seen in videos, I have seen in reality. But it's always important to think that we can overcome this. And as a researcher, as a historian, what actually kept me not just alive, but what kept me mentally good is that the history actually protected me. Because when you feel yourself responsible for protecting the future, you will always focus on your well-being, and you will be able to continue your life easily, although the security issues, the other issues might emerge later. I want to thank you, Haroro, for organizing this. I'm very glad to that I have listened twice to Gina. Her insights are very important. Also, Bart, thank you so much. Although we have never spoken before, but I feel like we are on the same page and we share many thoughts and ideas. It was a very important opportunity to discuss this topic because it touches everything in our life, our families, our communities, our future. It's very important to pay more attention to review what has been produced. We should always, and I advise not only at program on extremism, but if you can take this message to other universities, it's good that you are producing studies on terrorism, but it's also important that you always make sure that you sit on the table to review what has been produced, to review the development, and also to look around, to look at the current trends in the world. I think we can walk side by side and develop ourselves always. We will always need a new knowledge because those thugs, I would say, the terrorists, they always develop themselves. They learn quickly, and the technology is on their side. That's the problem. The technology is on their side, and we might find ourselves unable to limit the damage that they might cause. Yeah, I think this is what I wanted to say. I hope that this will be the first in a series, and it will continue to happen in the future. Thank you.
And as Omar does so well, he's corrected me. That was the perfect final note to end today's panel. Really, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be able to moderate this panel. Please keep in mind that the YouTube video, it's available. It's going to be posted up. It'll be tweeted out very soon. Thank you to all the panelists today, Bart, Gina, Omar, and yes, until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.